This game feels like you're playing Zelda, but you can play it on your phone. We're talking about Oceanhorn 2. Oceanhorn 2 is a semi-open world adventure game in the style of games like Breath of the Wild, and if you enjoy Zelda or Zelda-type games, you're gonna like it. Today we're gonna review it. Oceanhorn 2 first released in September of 2019 as an Apple Arcade exclusive. A year later, it came out on Nintendo Switch, and recently, in August of 2023, it got a release on next-gen consoles and PC. We're going to be breaking down Oceanhorn 2 into controls and gameplay, graphics, sound design, replayability, and story and characters, and I'm going to give you my summary and my overall thoughts at the end. In Oceanhorn 2, you play as the hero. As the hero, you are a knight in training, trying to become a knight of the realm, and as different things are happening, you're trying to solve a bunch of problems. You're trying to save the world. Typical video game stuff. So let's talk controls and gameplay. So as far as the controls go, touch controls on this game are pretty simple, not super complicated. They feel pretty good. As you're playing, you're going to notice that most of the controls are pretty well thought out, and the game was designed for mobile first, and so the touch controls are the way the game was initially designed to be played. Now, the game on the phone does support controllers, and that's how I played most of the time. When you're playing with the controller, the layout feels quite a bit more robust than when you're playing with touch controls. I would say if you have access to a controller, play this game with a controller. Now, you're not going to regret playing with the touch controls, but a controller, you're going to have a much better experience. I will say the brilliance of the controls of this game is that it really shows a meticulous attention to detail and a love for the genre on the part of the game developers. You can tell that they really spent a lot of time thinking about how they could make sure that the game would be as fun as possible. The puzzles that you have to solve throughout the game are satisfying. Even though the combat can become a little bit repetitive, you also do get that sense of accomplishment when you defeat a boss and when you get to move on to the next level and figure out the next thing. Overall, the gameplay is pretty smooth. I would rate it a 9 out of 10. Now we're going to talk graphics. Oceanhorn 2 is definitely one of the best looking games I've ever played on my iPhone. As I've already mentioned, it has a lot of visual cues that it borrows from games like Zelda, specifically Breath of the Wild, and there's a little bit of like Super Mario Galaxy mixed in there aesthetically as well. But overall, the game is really beautiful. A lot of the times I found myself really impressed that I was playing this game on my phone and not on a console. And while the graphics were updated quite a bit for subsequent releases on the Switch and on next-gen consoles, it by no means looks bad on the iPhone. It's also worth mentioning that Oceanhorn 2 is Oceanhorn 2. There's a game that came before, Oceanhorn, and you can tell that they spent a lot of time figuring out how to make this game look substantially better than the original. So for graphics, again, I'm going to give this game a 9 out of 10. Next, we're going to talk sound design, and I'm going to say the sound design in this game is pretty impressive as well. The music can get a little bit repetitive, and at times I wish that there was a little bit more variety, especially during combat or when I was facing major bosses. Sometimes the boss music didn't feel like it really evoked the sense of an important battle. It was just the same music I'd been listening to as I explored the area. That could be a little bit disappointing. Now, in terms of voice acting, I was actually pretty impressed by most of the voice acting that I heard in this game. Now, all of the main characters, the named characters, as well as quite a few of the quest givers have voice acted lines, but you can talk to a pretty wide array of characters throughout the game. It's not just named characters and quest givers. You can talk to random people throughout the streets as well, but only the named characters and the quest givers have voice acted lines. And so while I understand why you would do that in a mobile game and you would make that decision to kind of limit the number of voice acted lines that you have, sometimes it was a little bit frustrating that one person would speak to you verbally and the next person would speak to you only through lines on your phone. And so overall, I will say the sound design was pretty impressive, and I can't fault it too much for not everyone having voice actors, but the music got pretty repetitive. It wasn't my favorite, and I wish that there was a little bit more variety there. And so for sound design, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Now for story and characters. In Oceanhorn 2, the plot does stay pretty simple. It's not trying to break new ground with the story. The narrative really only serves as a container for the puzzles and the activities that you're doing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The story does what it needs to do to keep you moving forward. By the end of it, you're not necessarily going to feel super invested in what's happening to these characters, but again, the story was enough to pull you from point A to point B and keep going. I will say, I do wish at times that the story was a little bit more robust. It felt like, in certain ways, a rehash of stories I've played in other games, while at the same time being a little overly simplistic in some areas. And I don't want to go too far into it because I don't want to give spoilers for anyone who is interested in the story of the game. But again, the story was about as good as it needed to be to keep you engaged, but it didn't really do anything beyond that. So for me, story and characters, I'm going to give a 6 out of 10. Now on to replayability. So Oceanhorn 2 is actually a surprisingly big game. I mentioned most of the things that you're doing other than fighting creatures throughout the game, and there's a relatively limited number of creatures that you do fight, but those fights can be satisfying. But other than the creatures that you fight, you're mostly solving puzzles. Now, there is a pretty significant portion of the game that's open world. You can explore actually quite a bit more than I was expecting to be able to explore. I've played bigger games, AAA games, where I couldn't go as many places as I could go in Oceanhorn 2, and that was pretty impressive. When I finished the game, I finished the final boss fight, I'd only completed about 65% of the game. So that means that there was quite a bit that I didn't find. And there's even a few puzzles that I know that I kind of just moved on from because they weren't part of the main quest. I didn't need to finish them, and I was kind of rushing through the game a little bit. And so I want to go back and try and get some of those puzzles, find some of those treasures that I left behind, see what I could do to get to 100% completion. In that sense, I'll probably play through Oceanhorn 2 at least one more time, and that makes it more replayable than a lot of games I've played. I've said this a few times now, the story wasn't the most robust, but the gameplay itself was pretty satisfying. I had a good time, and I'm going to say, in terms of replayability, especially when you're considering that this is originally a mobile-first game, I'm going to give Oceanhorn 2 an 8 out of 10. So, my final thoughts, I think when it comes to Oceanhorn 2, the graphics are pretty impressive for a mobile game. The sound design does what it needs to do, and no more. Same with the story. The controls and the gameplay are extremely satisfying and well thought out, and it's a lot more replayable than a lot of mobile games that I've played before. I think it's the sort of game that's worth everyone's attention, and it's worth taking your time to go through at least once. That said, if you want to play Oceanhorn 2 on mobile, you're gonna need an Apple device with Apple Arcade. Apple Arcade, while there is a monthly charge, if you have a new Apple device or you've never had Apple Arcade before, you can get a free trial that's going to last you roughly 3 months. And if you don't have an Apple device and you have any of the other systems that it's come out on recently, so basically anything other than Android, the game will run you roughly $30. My final assessment, if you don't want Apple Arcade, is at least worth getting the trial so that you can play this game. If you have any of those other systems and you want to play it on something other than an Apple device, I think that you wouldn't be wasting your $30 to play Oceanhorn 2. My final score for Oceanhorn 2 is a 7.8 out of 10. Like I said a couple of times now, I'm actually pretty impressed with this game, and I'm looking forward to giving it a second playthrough. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what game you want me to review next.